Welcome, you're watching Head to Head. I'm Antonina and Tosha with UATV. Ukraine is the 9th largest country in the world in terms of the number of internally displaced persons. Following the start of conflict in eastern Ukraine and the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, the government of Ukraine reports some 1.5 million IDPs. Since the onset of the conflict, the United Nations Refugee Agency has been working for the protection of IDPs' rights. To talk more about this, we're joined in the studio today by Hugo Reichenberger. He's an external relations officer at the United Nations Refugee Agency in Ukraine. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
You're welcome, Antonina.
So as far as I know, before coming to Ukraine, you've worked for almost 5 years in different refugee and IDP emergencies in Africa and 2 years in Myanmar.
That's
right?
correct. That's correct.
And now that you work in Ukraine, so could you please, I guess, provide us with the analysis how Ukrainian refugees are different from those abroad?
Absolutely. So in these situations where I worked before, the situation is very different. First of all, in Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Chad, where I worked, in Myanmar, the numbers were larger in terms of refugees. So, for example, in Burkina Faso, there were 40,000 refugees from Mali. In Chad, there were 300,000 Darfur refugees from neighboring Sudan. And in Myanmar, we saw 700,000 refugees flee to Bangladesh. So the numbers of refugees were much larger. Here, there are only 2,620 refugees at the moment. But of course, we're also supporting the United Nations in providing humanitarian and protection assistance to the displaced persons in the east of Ukraine.
Okay. The United Nations has been working in Ukraine since 1994, and you provide shelter and non-food assistance to internally displaced persons and others affected by the conflict. You help prepare homes, schools, hospitals, and stuff like that. So the number you've mentioned, 2,600, right?
That's right.
This is an official figure. Whereas we all know that unofficial figures are much bigger. So do you have any information on that?
Yes, actually, those are the numbers of refugees that come from abroad into the country. But of course, as you mentioned, the numbers of IDPs is 1.5 million in the country. The United Nations estimates that 800,000 would be the closest numbers of internally displaced persons.
What is the difference in the mindset of internally displaced persons that had to flee their home because of the war conflict? And now I'm talking about the situation in Ukraine, and the IDPs that had to change the way of living due to some other reasons.
Look, the mindset, of course, is one of desperation sometimes, right? They had to flee their homes. Many of them had only seconds to prepare before they fled. We've met with many internally displaced persons, for example, in Severodonetsk, in Mariupol, in Sloviansk, and many have explained the situation of where they saw their bomb hit their house just seconds after they left it, and then they had to take all of their belongings and move to a safer town where they could try to integrate and start over their lives. So many of them are traumatized. The resident coordinator and our representative, Pablo Mateo, has called in the past for greater assistance for psychosocial types of assistance, because people who have fled their homes tend to be very traumatized, of course. And this is one thing that we've noticed.
In this situation, IDPs, what do they need more? A roof to stay under, in this case, I mean a shelter, or psychological assistance?
Look, the most important need that they have communicated to us, we have done in the beginning of the year a participatory assessment. So UNHCR in Ukraine meets every 2 years with the population that it's trying to assist. This year, we met with internally displaced persons in different villages along the contact line and also in different cities of Ukraine, and they have communicated that, of course, housing, shelter, a roof over their heads is one of the most important needs. Accessing job is another type of another important thing that they need, among others. But of course, the psychosocial needs are most pressing where people have really had this traumatizing event experience where they fled their homes.
Are there enough refugee shelters in Ukraine? Is there any?
So, again, for IDPs, right? You're referring to IDPs in the East, right? So, so a lot of the IDPs, they are living in homes. They are living in rented apartments. A very small minority are living in collective centers, right? In buildings where they were able to be welcomed and they could stay for the last 4 or 5 years. So they might have a roof over their head. But the main problem is, for example, paying for utilities, because a lot of them had to leave their jobs behind. The main challenge for many is paying for rent, for example. Another problem is, of course, buying their own shelter. So they might have roof over their heads, and this is another difference from what I saw in other countries where really refugee camps were established, IDP camps were established. Here, the IDPs are actually in homes, but they're having a lot of trouble paying that rent.
What needs to be done? Using your experience, what needs to be done to overcome this problem?
So the government of Ukraine is already doing a lot. They started some housing programs that support IDPs to rent, but UNHCR believes that more could be done to help those more vulnerables, because not all of them have enough resources to be able to pay for rent.
What would you advise to the community surrounding refugees and IDPs on how to behave the correct way with those people who had to flee their homes?
Yes, look, we see that in Ukraine, a lot of IDPs have been welcomed in the community, right? We also see, now moving on to the refugees, right? Refugees have come from all over the world, and a lot of them are actually integrating quite well because the Ukrainians have welcomed them so warmly. So, for example, there are many different stories that I could share, but there's, for example, an Afghani doctor in Odessa that is now helping Ukrainians find a good health again. And he talks about how he was welcomed by Ukrainians. We know a lady from Congo that had to flee the war in Congo that is now braiding the hairs of a lot of Ukrainian women, because we know that braids is a very popular fashion here. We also know of a refugee in Kharkiv that is making wooden arts that is very appreciated by the community. A Somali family that is making very strong peppers, because they noticed that in Ukraine the peppers weren't strong enough, so they started making their own peppers. So we can only thank the Ukrainians for having welcomed these refugees so warmly.
Ukraine is a hospitable country. And for the last question, what do IDPs need to do in case their human rights are being violated? Who do they turn to? Where do they go?
So we have UNHCR together with its NGO partners. We are not working by ourselves. We are working with very experienced and very skillful local NGOs. For example, Proliska in the east of Ukraine. Another example is the Right to Protection, another NGO that we are working with. These are all Ukrainian NGOs that we have partnered with for a number of years now. These NGOs have a hotline where IDPs can call in case they have a problem accessing their human rights, accessing their dignity.
And the number of the hotline, I presume, could be easily found online, right?
Yes, exactly. It can be very easily found on our website.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming and clarifying the whole situation for us and providing us with new necessary information.
You're welcome, Antonina.
That was Hugo Reichenberger. He's an external relations officer at the United Nations Refugee Agency in Ukraine. Thank you so much for watching UATV. Stay tuned for the rest.